Wolcen is an isometric action RPG that was kickstarted under the name Umbra. It completely shattered its goal of $225,000 and successfully raised around $406,000. It went into early access on March 24th, 2016 and was officially released on February 13th, 2020, which is when I started playing. And right off the bat, so I can get it out of the way, I have to say that this game is absolutely gorgeous. Some of the maps have a level of detail that is unparalleled in its genre. Some of the skill animations are fascinating to see for the first time, and throughout the story mode, I never got tired of watching all the different ways I could obliterate the seemingly endless roster of enemies, which in my opinion is genuinely important. It's borderline necessary to have a wide variety of opponents and scenery that keeps the player interested, and in this aspect, Wolcen passed with flying colors, at least for the first 30 hours of gameplay. Now with that compliment out of the way, I can talk about the slow descent into madness that this game threw me into. Mind you, I'm going to try to stay as objective as possible. I'm not out to give this game a hard time, but I will be focusing on the problems with the game in general, along with issues that I personally encountered. This is not a review. I'm not going to tell you how to live your life, so if you want to play it, then play it. If you don't, well then that's okay too. This goes without saying for anyone that's played Wolcen, but this game was beyond broken at launch. You name a problem and Wolcen had it. The worst being that the server couldn't support the player base, and they even had to fix the play button in their first post-release patch. It was a disaster, and the developers knew it. They were clearly caught off guard by the sheer amount of people that ended up taking interest in their game. But the server issues were fixed as quickly as they could be, along with some soft locks and item deletion issues, both of which Wolcen was riddled with. This game has had more bugs than Bunny, and it's very clear that it would take a long time for things to get ironed out. There's just too much to be fixed. There's no way that this game should have been released in this state, but there are various theories on why it was, to which I'll let you look into yourself instead of making accusations. Now, I'm not some hardcore Super Saiyan Ultra Mega Chad gamer, okay? But I'm not complete trash either. It's also worth noting that I played Wolcen with a competent cooperative partner, so my first playthrough is vastly different than someone who decided to play solo. Playing this game with a friend undoubtedly made the experience much better, and I said all of that to make this point. In my opinion, this game had an incredible difficulty curve at the first boss. This boss is easier solo because if you die, you can revive yourself 3 times, but in co-op, if you both die, the game is over. This isn't normally a problem, aside from the fact that certain moves can halt the revive process, and you simply do not have the tools to combat this at such a low level. But the major issue I have with fighting this boss in particular has nothing to do with its moveset. Instead, it's directly linked to the core of Wolcen's attribute system. In most other RPGs, if you raise your strength, then you do more attack damage. If you raise your wisdom, then you do more magic damage. Dexterity for bows, defense for armor points, the list goes on. It's basic Dungeons and Dragons stuff, and it's pretty much the same throughout every RPG I've ever played, except Wolcen. Because in this game, you have a percentage-based system, with a damage buff that takes into account the total level of all of your attributes. Ferocity increases crit chance, agility increases attack speed, wisdom increases status ailment score, and that leaves us with toughness, which thankfully has a flat modifier for health. And I mean, sure, agility will make you attack faster, which is nice and all, but ferocity and wisdom are just attributes that curve RNG mechanics. So when you inevitably die at the first boss for getting cocky and building too aggressively into these skills, you're forced with an ultimatum. Go super epic pro gamer on this boss by learning its flowchart and being able to dodge every one-hit KO attack while simultaneously managing the increasingly harsh cooldown, or just reset your attributes and dump it all into toughness. As time went on, I felt less and less inclined to use any other attribute, seeing as how I'm a mage with no reason for attack speed, and I don't feel like sacrificing tens of thousands of health points for a few crits and ailments. Those of you that haven't played this game yet may think this is a fairly shallow topic that I'm forcing a long-winded speech about, but this goes beyond the just get good mentality. The getting good part was learning how to address the problem in the game, on literally its most basic fundamental level mechanic. Just wait until we get to all the other shit that needs to be covered. So seeing as how the attribute system only affects damage loosely instead of directly, you're able to directly increase damage output through the gem system, which, and this is important, is heavily RNG dependent and a huge gold sink. I can't really complain about this too much because it's pretty standard, just like how games in this genre usually have a cost to resetting your attribute points, but Wolcen's prices are incredibly steep, especially in early game, because because before you're able to make enough money, you'll most likely end up gaining a level which increases the cost even more. So as you realize that a stat point reset is your only course of action, there's a major issue that many face in their real day-to-day lives. They're fucking broke. Luckily, there was a quick and hilariously easy solution called gold duping. And before you keyboard warriors start having a hissy fit, let me show you how easy it is. You take a gem, stack it onto another gem of the same type, then unseparate them. Bam, double the sell price. Now what's better? Running old maps for an hour and a half, picking up all the shit you can find, then selling it for Mojabe's pocket change, or creating practically infinite wealth while you sit there and wait for a cup of noodles to cook. I personally chose the latter and decided to move on with my life. Which reminds me, you know what else is expensive? The passive skill point tree. It's like Path of Exile skill tree, but just, less. You can move them around to create more streamlined builds, and I actually love this system because of the incredible amount of control it gives over how your character plays. I'm a huge fan and think it's a wonderful decision, but with all these options, it's likely at some point you're going to want a reset. But they don't take gold. No, that would be too fucking obvious and simple and convenient. They take these little purple circles that I like to call gemmies, and throughout the story you can acquire these gemmies by getting NX of a skill that you've already obtained. These are drops that are mixed with all the other loot that spread across the map in chests, breakable shit, and decomposing remains of your various fallen victims. But again, luckily, there's another cop-out that you can use. You could skip all that terrible RNG and buy NX from Demetria. Her shop is on a 15-minute cooldown, and this could be bypassed by logging out and logging back in, allowing you to slowly but surely sell all of them for 10 gemmies each, and eventually earn yourself a passive reset that way. I personally was sure to save every single gemmy I had for the resets because it turns out that a lot of these special passive skills are completely broken. For example, I'm a tank mage. My whole playstyle revolves around me having a ridiculous amount of shield so I can aggro enemies and take the big boy hits. At some point, I thought it would be a fantastic idea to get a passive skill called Faith Leech, which converts all of my lifesteal into shield points. I know, I'm fucking brilliant, but hold your applause, because if you just so happen to proc Faith Leech while your shield is full, it would create an overflow error and your shield would instantly drop to 1. As you can probably guess, this is fucking debilitating, and it's not like this was some kind of anomaly either, because at launch there were at the very least 16 passives that simply just did not work. The worst part is that if you wanted to get rid of one of these passives, because they don't work, then you have to pay the full price of the reset to redo the whole tree. There is no option just to change a single skill point. Again, these are just major problems on the most basic aspects of this game, still trying to be objective. After beating the Act 1 boss, you are generously awarded with the power to ascend, which looks cool and gives you badass new skills when you use the power up. But most importantly, it stops attacks from interrupting your revive. So if you're playing in a group, you'll only use Ascendancy when someone's knocked down. Oh, by the way, it's also worth noting that Ascending eats your force shield on exit because fuck mages. Even though I just bitched and moaned ad nauseum about the first act boss, at the very least he worked. The same can't be said for Heimlock, the third act boss. At the time I was running a stasis build, because the bad guys can't hit you if they can't move. Again, this is big brain thinking I'm doing here. But unfortunately, if you hit Heimlock with stasis, he decides to become an invulnerable statue and softlock the game, because Wolcen. Fortunately, this was fixed in the post-release patch 1.05, or as I like to refer to it as, the no fun patch. They also managed to fix a good chunk of the broken passive skills. The only problem was that there was not a free passive reset. So if players spent time to carefully work around the tree's previously broken skills, they would then have to pay an upfront cost just to fix their build again. The devs also said that they were showing summoners love, but most minions were still pretty useless aside from the first act. They didn't even have health bars. But most unfortunately, and feel free to light a candle in my honor, all the gold I exploited out of the game was stolen from me. So I'm back to being poor again, just like in real life. But I'm not the only one, because multiple players reported that their gold was also taken away, despite the fact that they actively refused to take part in the dupe glitch. On top of that, this patch is preambled by informing a special group of players that the glory days are officially over. Some particularly savvy people that rushed to the endgame and gained access to the black market were able to modify unique items in order to make them viable in endgame. But no, this did not sit well with the dev team, because they stated how even though it made the game fun and that these players somehow MacGyvered an incredible amount of utility out of these otherwise useless weapons and armor, that the ability to modify items in such a way was not a part of the experience that the developers intended, and that these players would have to wait for the mechanic to be implemented at an undisclosed later date. This was devastating to me because modifying unique weapons and feeling as though I was able to fix the lackluster stat bonuses myself was the only practical goal I had after finding out that the Uber bosses were just 3 different super buff versions of the same boss I already defeated. This seems to be a common theme because throughout the entire endgame there wasn't a single unique boss that I could find. In fact, I've been fighting this electric beam using monstrosity since the fucking tutorial level. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was fantastic that throughout the main story there was a diverse cast of creatures, but everything gets stagnant immediately afterwards. And by everything, I mean everything. Finally, to round out this patch, there's one glaring issue that I've absolutely refused to talk about up until this point, and that's a skill called Bleeding Edge. The reason I've waited this long to even mention Bleeding Edge is because it will inevitably lead the video astray into a tangent about the ARPG game loop in itself, so buckle up. Having a broken skill in this game is not entirely Wolcen's fault. This skill was so grotesquely efficient that Bleeding Edge became a meme in the Wolcen community, and it was not only considered the best skill to use, but was often debated as the only viable option for the highest level of play. It is somewhat unfortunate though, because at some point around level 30, I felt like every skill in the game had substantial power. My character was a gun-toting mage with minions and a turret that could quickly shoot people Red Dead Redemption style, and then pour flames out of their hands. Things were going great, but as time went on, the urge to min-max took over, and I realized that my playstyle was not going to work for much longer. I wasn't killing enemies fast enough. I wasn't being as efficient as the game required me to. As I said, this is less of a problem with Wolcen and more of a problem with ARPGs in general. Your hand seems to be forced into picking the most optimal playstyle, regardless of the fact that it might not be your intention or even enjoyable for that matter. This reduces the number of skills that you use to the absolute very best that the game has to offer in order to keep progressing. And with the high risk, high reward 3-tier expedition system that they've implemented, you have enough to worry about with the soft lock bugs, ridiculous one-hit KO boss moves, and morale destroying crashes to even think about using a subpar strategy which will inevitably lead to an early death and back in town a half an hour later walking away with nothing. Long story short, Bleeding Edge was nerfed in order to coax the community into finding new ways to walk through an otherwise brutal and unforgiving endgame. After losing my illegitimate fortune, the reality of my situation set in. Endgame is not just a grind, it's a test of will. Like sure, they reduced the cost of actually being able to access the bosses, but at the same time they also halved the productivity of expeditions. How long am I willing to fight for the opportunity to encounter an Uber boss? How many attempts am I willing to make before conceding? And even worse, if I'm able to beat the bosses, what will I do next? At this point, my co-op buddy bailed out because of a crash that happened in the third map of an expedition, which is not uncommon and is hands down the most infuriating situation to be put in, so I don't blame them whatsoever. But seeing as how I'm well over 2,000 words into a script about this game, I felt obligated to push forward without them, and my assumption is that Wolcen had nowhere to go but up. On to patch 106 and patch 107. They're both hotfixes, the former fixing Korean localization and a bug in the beginning of Act 3. However, the latter was a nerf to Bulwark of Dawn and Winter's Grasp that were supposed to be implemented in patch 1.05. At the time I was working on a Winter's Grasp build, so I was upset to learn that the cooldown would no longer scale with its level. This led some members of the community to state how the developers were more interested in nerfing builds rather than making an enjoyable game. It was good that they were actively working on story mode being 100% playable, but many endgame softlocks still existed, along with items still being deleted or otherwise disappearing despite a previous attempt to fix the problem. But it's worth noting that this is still only 3 weeks into the game's launch. In terms of release date, this game is not that old, but I was still putting my nose to the grindstone, and over time, loneliness started to set in. Even though I play in online mode, I felt like I was the only human actually playing this game, which I know is a lie because of the countless builds on YouTube and endless bitching on the subreddit that consistently proved that theory wrong. People are playing, but individually or in small segregated groups. It's not like playing co-op was all sunshine and rainbows either. There was no ability to just join the game with someone else in town. Both players had to be in the main menu and both had to launch simultaneously. This meant that if for some reason or another a person in your squad ends up disconnecting, then everyone has to exit their game and re-invite them. My apologies for getting slightly off topic again, but as I was saying, this game is just lonely. It's unfortunate because the transmog system allows you to create a unique looking character, and it's truly astounding what some players have been able to create. It would be fantastic to find some someone running around town with a cool build or a nice theme and invite them to a party without having to literally exit the game and go onto a forum just to find them. Like I said, it's just unfortunate. It's a wasted opportunity in my opinion. In an interview with GameStar, the devs apparently said that the first 4 months of patches would be solely dedicated to fixing the game's core issues. I say apparently because this interview is locked behind a paywall and a language barrier, so this Reddit post of a translation and summary is all I have to go off of. But from what I've noticed, these developers aren't oblivious to the situation they've put themselves in, and are actively trying to correct the mistakes they've made. Even if the focus is sometimes shifted in the wrong direction, they have given a respectable amount of effort so far. At this point, there were still quite a few bugs and glitches that stop momentum and make the game difficult to keep playing, and most notably the never-ending slews of ways to find yourself out of bounds. While this problem was magnified in the endgame, they were still in story mode as well. That being said, patch 8 is when a lot of major improvements were made. They finally fixed the right-click, left-click issue when trading, which was infuriating for a lot of players. Projectiles were more consistent, smaller monsters were easier to hit, and at long last minions received health bars. They reduced the amount of monsters you need to kill for some expeditions because that was yet another way to softlock yourself, along with making some other monsters weaker overall by giving a heavy nerf to the tough modifier. There were also some really solid nerfs put in place when it comes to boss battles. The regeneration effect was taken away from them completely because that was also a softlock. Not only that, but numerous other modifiers would only show up half as often. The size of mobs that bosses could make on the final map of expeditions was cut in half, along with the cooldown for summoning mobs being triple the length of time. Oh, and Electric Beam Trap Boy could no longer throw you outside of the battle zone. But wait, there's more! And the Elite Justicar got nerfed into the ground, which I was ecstatic about because he's nothing but a pussy shield-wielding bitch boy and put there to waste my time and kill my momentum. You know, remaining objective, trying to at least. I'm trying desperately to remain objective. All in all, I'd say this patch is a big success in my book. Fast forward to shortly thereafter, and Wolcen has now been out for a full month. The dev team make a public announcement about Operation Second Dawn. This offers a fairly decent roadmap and stating how there will be leagues with different mechanics that separate characters. It's kind of like Path of Exile except for... well, exactly like Path of Exile. So now it's March 13th, and I have to be completely honest with you, my friends. At this point, I pretty much stopped playing Wolcen altogether. The simple fact is that I was burned out trying to squeeze fun out of a game that clearly didn't allow for it at this point in time. I could argue until I'm blue in the face about the shortcomings Wolcen had, and probably could have made this a really humorous section of the video at their expense. But in reality, I simply moved on, and decided to observe this game from a distance. Shortly thereafter, Patch 10 came out, and in the preamble, the team went over the travel ban in France and how it affects the development for Wolcen as a whole. Like many others across the world, their employees have to work from home. In this patch, there's a lot of damage buffs that made quite a few passive skills a little bit more reliable, including Slayer's Flurry, Anvil's Woe, and Wrath of Bahamut, otherwise known as Kratos' Chains. These buffs seem to be a great idea in my opinion because it incentivizes diversity by increasing the damage of these close-range attacks instead of just continuing to nerf Bleeding Edge. There were of course more bug fixes involving crashes because you could never have enough of those, and my absolute favorite line of text from any patch note so far fixed an issue causing players to have balloons instead of heads when playing the game on Proton. Patch 11 then comes out with no intro text. The bulk of these notes involve adding a new tier of unique weapons for level 65 and up. They also updated localization across the board, but unfortunately Wolcen was experiencing a rapidly dwindling and impatient player base. Most players either took a break like I did or flat out quit after the fun exploits were taken out, but some of those who stayed became bitter at their experience. Looking in the comments of these patch notes, you will find that it's mostly negative feedback regarding the confusion over the mechanics and a general lack of substantial content. While work was being done despite the hardship of our newfound global pandemic, these problems have been an overarching theme that plagued Wolcen since the very beginning of its launch. Patch 12 also came out with no intro text. This update mainly focused on bugs that involve collision, as it was apparently still a common occurrence for players to fall through the floors of various maps. There was also multiple bug fixes to the friends list, and they gave a long-awaited solution to a black screen glitch, plus unique armors got a new tier. Oddly enough, there's no replies on this forum thread. It didn't make sense to me because every single patch up until this point had replies applies to it. When inquiring about this anomaly on the Wolcen Discord, I quickly got a message from a user who stated that the forums were experiencing technical difficulties at the time, due to them trying to implement a requirement of having your Wolcen account attached to Steam and actually owning the game. Now, had this been any other game aside from Wolcen, I would tear into them saying how this is censorship and blah 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 and all that stuff. But seeing as how Wolcen's community is very well known for being extremely critical of its progress, I understand why they would actually want people that own the game to be on their forum thread. That being said, the entire comment system being broken for 2 weeks because they tried to implement something new is the most Wolcen thing I've ever heard. Patch 13 introduced the new tier of unique accessories, and aside from that, it was just more bug fixes, again, can't have enough of those, and as always, more localization. This is also when I decided to give the game another chance. Unfortunately, I feel obligated to inform you people that I've completely thrown objectivity out of the window. There's absolutely no way I was playing through the whole story again. It just wasn't happening. So I went back to Endgame and picked up where I left off. I was out of practice, moving slowly, but it was still satisfying watching the seemingly endless mobs explode in front of me. I launched an expedition, because despite its flaws, I think the expedition is the best endgame content available at the moment. But as I stated much earlier in the video, expeditions are a gamble. If you die, you walk away with nothing. And that's exactly what Wolcen seems to want. The game wants you to spend massive amounts of time with no progress, so you feel obligated to play more. And I was reminded that even though I made it to the boss, I still had to kill an undisclosed amount of enemies on the map. I don't know how that slipped my mind. After reaching the third map, the game taunts me with an offer of a random modifier, trying to bait me into making the level more difficult for a chance at better gear. This offer does not interest me. I don't want any special treatment, I just want to do my job. I try to run through this level as fast as I can, but my basic attack is left click, and this is also the movement button, and it is locked and bound to this key. So as I slowly make my way through the level and reach the final boss of my expedition, the reality of my situation sets in again. The spinning blades surrounding this battle chip away at my energy shield, which stops it from regenerating. This guarantees my defeat, because without my protective shell that I have spent the whole game perfecting, I am only one hit away from an inevitable death. A demise that comes quickly, because as soon as my hit points reach 0 for the third time, I am instantly sent back to town. And I would genuinely like to think the odds of getting that specific boss were low, but it's as if the game knew my exact build and made sure I would fail, doing everything in its power to stop me from reaching success. It wasn't a bug or a glitch that killed me. I didn't fall through the floor, and my game didn't crash. In fact, everything ran completely smoothly aside from a few frame drops and some unresponsive inputs when using specific skills. To the best of my knowledge, the game works fine now. It's somewhat stable. However, there is little satisfaction to be had during the endgame. Just looking at the Stormfall restoration screen, I see an obscene amount of hours that I would have to dedicate to this game, and it's a daunting task to say the least. Sure, there are numerous ways to improve my playstyle, and the Stormfall restoration has multiple projects that increase the productivity, but at the end of the day, it boils down to sinking another 50 hours into this game, and I cannot bring myself to do that. I can't even bring myself to get the productivity to unlock a 5th skill slot, which is bullshit, because you should always have 5 skill slots, and you should be able to put a skill where your basic attack is, but I fucking digress. The simple fact is that for me personally, the reward this game offers is not worth the time invested, and Wolcen has just completely lost my interest. Despite the fact I failed in my quest to make a purely objective video about Wolcen, ignoring the reality of me actually quitting the game in the process of writing this script and pushing all of its flaws to the side, I look back on this game fondly. In fact, some of its flaws are what made the game special. There was a lot of fun to be had, even if sometimes it had to be forced out, but over time the enjoyment became more difficult to find. You can call me a cheater or a duper or whatever you'd like, but I loved how laughably easy it was to exploit this game on launch. It circumvented a lot of tedium that was required to buy the myriad of overpriced projects and resets, and while it was definitely not fun encountering a game-breaking bug, it forced the community to use their collective knowledge of the game to overcome it. Wolcen was never going to be a perfect game. That concept doesn't even exist in my mind. I mean, for fuck's sakes, guys, it's not even the game that was originally advertised on its Kickstarter. If you look at the trailer for Umbra, it bears little to almost no resemblance to Wolcen's end product. There's still mechanics that haven't been implemented and stretch goals that haven't been met, like adding player houses. But given enough time, believe it or not, Wolcen does have have the opportunity to grow into a respectable name in the ARPG genre. It all depends on two things: if the developers are willing to hold true to their promises, and if the community is willing to stick with it long enough for them to do so. And no matter how harsh I might be with my criticisms in this video, I genuinely wish the best for everyone involved. But as always, I want to know what you think as well. Did you enjoy playing Wolcen, or did you eventually have to move on like I did? Feel free to leave your responses in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like. If you hated this video, then give me a dislike and comment why you hated it. If you really enjoyed me talking about Wolcen and want to hear me ramble on about various other topics in video games such as this one, then go ahead and subscribe. But most importantly, stay safe and have a nice day.